Buenas noches a todos, a todas. Espero que estén muy bien. Estamos esperando unos segundos para poder empezar oficialmente con la conferencia del día de hoy. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Bienvenidos también a quienes nos van a ver después, cuando se van a conectar luego con la grabación. Yo soy Mariana Alegre, soy directora ejecutiva de Lima, Cómo vamos, y de la plataforma Ciudades, Cómo vamos, y es un placer estar en esta ocasión en este panel del cuarto foro Ciudad. La conferencia de hoy está titulada Participación Ciudadana, Representación Cultural y el Museo de la Pequeña Comunidad, y está a cargo de Susan Schelt, a quien ya van a presentar en unos momentos. Pero antes quiero nuevamente darles la bienvenida, agradecerles por acompañarnos y también agradecer a nuestros socios y miembros, la Asociación UNASEM, la Universidad Católica, RPP, RIMAC Seguros, Enel X, Uber, Lima Expresa, Didi, DP World y la Embajada de Estados Unidos, con quienes estamos organizando una serie de charlas como parte del foro Ciudades Cómo Vamos, entre ellas esta. Por si acaso, y en términos logísticos, para esta conferencia vamos a contar con apoyo de traducción, así que aquellos que quieren pueden hacerle clic a la opción de español en el botón de la interpretación. Y en ese sentido tener el idioma que mejor les acomode. Le doy pase a María Fe del Solar, ella es coordinadora de programas de intercambio de la Oficina de Asuntos de Prensa, Cultura y Educación de la Embajada de Estados Unidos en Lima, quien nos dará unas breves palabras de bienvenida y presentará a nuestra expositora. Bienvenida, María Fe, adelante.
Hola Mariana, ¿qué tal? Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a todos por estar acá el día de hoy. Es un gusto acompañarlos ya por segunda vez en el foro Ciudades Cómo Vamos. Y la semana pasada estuvimos con Natalia Olson, que nos habló sobre cómo desarrollar servicios, operaciones urbanas más eficientes. Esta noche quiero presentarles a Susan Schelt, quien nos hablará sobre la participación ciudadana, representación cultural y el Museo de la Pequeña Comunidad. Susan obtuvo su doctorado en antropología en el Centro de Graduación de la City University of New York, y su tesis profundizó en la expresión cultural de los jóvenes, la autoimagen pública y los mercados públicos en el contexto de Dakar, Senegal. Es miembro también de Public Space Research Group, presidenta del Departamento de Antropología de la Universidad Estatal de California, y presidenta electa de la Sociedad de Antropología Urbana Nacional, Transnacional y Global. Además de analizar parques y playas, Susan revisa el activismo archivístico y el impacto de los museos comunitarios como una forma de espacio público. Antes de comenzar, quisiera recordarles que pueden dejar sus preguntas también acá a través del Zoom, en el chat o en los comentarios en Facebook. Muchas gracias a todos y bienvenida Susan.
Unmute Suzanne.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Northridge, California, and I want to recognize and acknowledge this Sesa Vitam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of the Sesavenga that is now occupied by Northridge and its residents. I honor their elders, past and present, and Sesa Vitam descendants who are citizens of the Fernandino Tatavian Band of Mission Indians. Thank you for inviting me to share my work with you today. I especially want to thank those who were involved in inviting me and in organizing the event. Jamie Finlader, who organized the talk, and the US State Department, and specifically the US Embassy in Lima, Maria del Solar, Ed Cox, Vanessa Wenger, and also Ana Claudia Oshige from Lima, Cómo vamos. I'm excited to share with you this evening, and I'm really honored to have been invited. So thank you, everyone, for all of your work. Being invited to speak in this forum is especially meaningful to me because at an earlier point in my life, I lived and worked in South America. Between 1989 and 1992, I served in the US Peace Corps in Paraguay, and I lived in a small hamlet associated with a small town approximately 90 kilometers south of Asunción. And I helped to promote the National Health Education Program in the hamlet. I extended my service for 6 months to work in the education department in the health ministry. And on my way back to the US, I visited other cities in South America, including Lima, Cusco, Puno, among others. And it took me 6 months to return to the US because I thoroughly loved living and traveling in South America. I loved learning about the diverse cultures. It was obvious to me that anthropology was the way to go when I returned. And so I enjoyed thinking about these memories today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you again. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Small Community Museum as a form of public space and what it has to offer when thinking about urban planning. I will talk about the strengths of these spaces and consider the challenges that they face as they try to maintain themselves as vital public space. At the end, I hope we can have a conversation about ways to support these spaces and what these spaces might mean as cities develop going forward. And this presentation is informed by many years of studying the publicness and cultural diversity of public parks. I have done a number of studies with Seth Lowe and Dana Taplin, members of the Public Space Research Group at CUNY. And we all believe that public parks are places where members of urban communities come together, learn about one another, and create a sense of belonging. Given the growing trend towards privatizing urban parks and public space in general, it's been important for us to speak out about the importance of public space and its role in the sustainability and vitality of communities. This presentation is also informed by research I conducted among small museums and cultural institutions in the San Fernando Valley, which is in Los Angeles, California. And this was with the support of a grant from the Human Interaction Research Institute at the Valley Nonprofit Resources Program at my university, Cal State Northridge. That study is entitled Archival Activism, and it examines the approaches that small museums and cultural institutions take to working with archives and engendering inclusive and accessible archives. In addition to this, my talk is informed by a bit of autoethnography, as I've been an active member in the museum for over 4 years, the Museum of the San Fernando Valley, that is. Today, the main point that I want to get across is the small community museum, like public parks, are important spaces in communities. On the one hand, these spaces are ideal. They bring diverse people together. They engage people. Community members strive. They strive to become informed. These are creative spaces, often accessible. They foster teamwork. They foster network for community projects that go beyond the goals of a museum. And they can be community centers as well as the center of communities. I also think it's interesting that these spaces are very free and they don't often have to answer to too many government bodies. And this creates an interesting situation for the things that take place in community museums. That said, at the same time, the Small Community Museum does a dance of sorts to navigate the politics of cultural representation. Some participants seek to represent cultural events without having the tools to critically examine the enduring inequalities that are produced by events. These cause discomfort for other members. Museum participants have different relationships to historical events, whereas some imagine particular events are far enough in the past so that they're safe to discuss publicly. Others sometimes feel that it is too soon and insensitive to openly discuss. In short, navigating which aspects of the past to discuss and how to discuss them is very complex. And it doesn't help to be facing the challenge while managing while confronting these issues, while also managing the expected constraints that small community museums face, such as limited budgets, limited human resources, unanticipated legal challenges, and the increased demand for quality programs, a facet of urban economies now rely on tourism and entertainment for a boost to the system. So the small community museum is a vital public space, but it is also one that requires a complex set of skills in order to navigate it. And given these dynamics, I think it's worth discussing what goes on in small community museums and how they fit into the overall fabric of the city. So just very briefly, I want to clarify the notion of cultural representation, in case this is a new term, in the spirit of sharing more about my time in Paraguay, since I'm here with you in Lima. I'd like to share an experience I had that I think communicates the concept of cultural representation in general. And then I'll turn to link this to talking about museums. So I want to show you some images. Oops, now, how do I show images? Okay. So during my service, I had a good friend who was a school teacher, and she lived in the town at the bottom of a cerro, and I lived at the top of the cerro in a community of cotton and pineapple farmers. And she proposed that we organize an adult literacy program for community members in the cerro. She observed that many felt disadvantaged by their limited literacy skills in Spanish. And as you probably already know, in Paraguay, Spanish is the official language in banks and businesses and schools, but Guarani is more widely spoken. In 1992, legislation was passed to elevate the support for bilingual education in schools, but based on current research, however, this legislation doesn't seem to have resulted in a better balance of language among farmers. At any rate, we organized night classes, which were held in a one-room schoolhouse illuminated by kerosene lamps, the funds for which were raised by hosting soccer games where teams of girls played against teams of boys. And I smile now at the idea that an all-female team was considered to be a spectacle that it could effectively lead to profitable fundraising. To make a long story short, the program was very successful, and students documented their dreams and wrote haiku poetry, and they were very proud of their work. So we created an informal publication with the students writing and illustrations and photos from a class field trip we took to Asuncion. The students gave the publication its title, Ropaipa, which in Guarani means we're all awake, we are all aware. What happened next was surprising. Gossip from the town to the top of the cerro revealed that some thought the instructor had fabricated the students' writing. Others thought that the publication was some form of American propaganda, yet others discredited the publication because everyone knows campesinos can't write. This discourse made us wonder, what other forms of discrimination would follow such disparaging views of individuals who were merely enthusiastic about learning language? Now, to connect this back to cultural representation in small museums, this incident illustrates how efforts to represent oneself through language engender pride, empowerment, and a sense of legitimacy. But they also create an opportunity for others to apply their own meanings to the situation. Stuart Hall, a famous British Jamaican cultural studies scholar, talked about the notion of cultural representation as a site of struggle. And through discourse and meaning, truths can be manipulated, and actions are taken based on new truths. In this case, influential speakers in the town persuasively defined the literacy program in the Cerro as problematic. No more classes were offered after this. And the controversy left people in the Cerro feeling ambivalent too, so there was no more conversation about it at all. In retrospect, it is also not surprising that there was such a strong reaction from the town toward an adult literacy program for farmers. The town was not far from Asuncion, a center of cosmopolitanism, and townspeople had their own complex about belonging within the orbit of the capital. Regulating the image of farmers could be seen as a means to bolster their own representations. And in this case, I think what we learn is that urban space is a producer of the need to create an arbitrarily assigned cultural meanings onto others in order to protect one's own power and status. And these power dynamics are based in spatial hierarchies. And thinking about the spatial hierarchies, I think, is useful when thinking about the struggles over cultural representation in small community museums. So now on to the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles in California. And briefly, I'm going to use some slides to describe the valley to give you a sense of what this place is like. And then we'll take a look at the museum. So San Fernando Valley is, as I say, within the political boundaries of Los Angeles. But because there are hills between LA and the valley, it seems like it's its own discrete place. There are approximately 1.75 million residents. 43% are white, 41% are Latino, 3.4 African American, 10.2 Asian, and at least 3 tribes have a very strong presence in the valley. 2 are federally recognized, and 1 is trying to get federal recognition. And there are many immigrant communities in the valley as well, especially from Central America, and the Armenian community is very large. The Iranian community is very large as well. It's a very diverse place. CSUN, my university, is also a big economic engine. Oops, let me show you the CSUN. 4,000 faculty and staff work there. Yes.
Suzanne, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides.
None of these you could see?
I can't see your slides. Sorry.
Oh no, that's terrible. I showed you all these fun slides. All right. Okay. Uh-oh. Thank you for interrupting and telling me that. That's too bad.
It took us a while to realize.
Oh, no. That's too bad. These were I'm not going to talk about them. I want to just show you that, I was talking about this community in Paraguay when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and this is the community. And this was part of the school of the literacy program, and the trip to Asuncion, and the rail to Argentina. So I think we're now heading into the San Fernando Valley. And this is sort of what it looks like. The buildings are not very high. The university is the economic engine. And I've just mentioned this because because other things are happening in the valley. There's deindustrialization. Many of the manufacturing industries that once put San Fernando Valley on the map have declined, such as the aeronautic industry, which used to be very large in the valley, and General Motors, Chevrolet, once had a very large plant up until the 1990s. And this is what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay. And today, I wanted to point out that these, while the valley has been deindustrialized, these spaces are now what has replaced the General Motors factory is a shopping center, which is called the Plant. And this is a reference to the plant. And the only things that commemorate this very important industry back in the day are the facades of the buildings. But a lot of shoppers don't even understand what these architectural references are referring to. Other industries are also coming to an end in the San Fernando Valley. Because of the valley had a lot of space in Southern California, there's a lot of space. Outdoor sports are very big, and baseball, for example, California is thought as baseball-landia, and so is the San Fernando Valley. But a lot of spaces for young people have been converted also into housing, tracks, and commercial centers. And another thing that is also changing and is in decline is you may be interested to know that the San Fernando Valley used to be the center of a very large adult film production industry, but now due to services on the internet, this industry is also declining, and it's no longer considered to be one of the biggest centers of adult entertainment film production. So what's going on is tourism is on the rise in terms of providing fuel for the economy, and many because of the change, this positions museums in a new place and gives them new importance. And so museums are, and historical societies, you know, have their spaces, but I wanted to show this picture because of two reasons. It shows that the Museum of the San Fernando Valley has this program, Horses Across the Valley. And so it tries to extend its presence into the community by having these kinds of projects, and the horse is iconic in the San Fernando Valley. So you begin to see the presence of museums in street corners and in other places. I wanted to also share that other things that are iconic in the San Fernando Valley is the cars, I guess, because of General Motors and its role in the economy up until the 1990s. But it also becomes this sort of cultural feature in the valley. And we have this whole culture of lowriders and really interesting aesthetics on the cars, really interesting things that they do with the cars, as well as building buildings to look like cars. So there's a lot of really interesting history for the museum to commemorate. And this is a historical cultural monument that I wanted to share with you because I find it interesting that food is so important in the valley, and to the point that a fast food restaurant is elevated to the status of historical cultural monument, the Munch Box, where they make hickory hamburgers. But I also wanted to show how what this particular building is also interesting and is talked about in the museums and the historical societies because of the architectural feature of the stone wall. There are a lot of, there were stone quarries that, you know, produced a lot of this material. And so you see in the valley this flavor of architecture where there are a lot of, you know, stone columns and stone walls. And even when there is no stone, there are stones painted into the pavement. So the valley has got a lot of interesting things going on that are very, you know, exciting to work with in museums. The final sort of thing I want to point out are the murals. The valley has so many interesting murals in different areas. Here is one of Kobe Bryant. This is another one that's done by Levi Ponce, who is very well known in the valley. He's done so many interesting pieces of art on murals. And Richie Valens is a very popular image also in the valley. And so we see him on murals all over town. And we see other themes as well, celebrating American Indians. We see other themes as well. Judy Baca is a very famous muralist who did a mile-long project called the Great Wall, and she recently received something like $5 million to extend this particular project and up until the current time period. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the valley, and so there's a lot of need, both an economic need, a cultural need for a museum. And it's very interesting that given all the urbanization, given all the change, given all the growth that's happening, that the San Fernando Valley doesn't have a top tier museum uniquely devoted to the stewardship of the history and culture of the San Fernando Valley. So that niche is being filled by a community museum. And this community museum of the San Fernando Valley started about 20 years ago. It started at Valley Community College. It moved online, and it was online for a while, for a couple of years. Then it moved to a kiosk in a shopping mall, and then it moved to an office space. And recently, due to COVID, it had to move out of the office space, and it moved across the street to this new center where there are a lot of different businesses that are on this kind of campus type of thing. This is not the university campus. It's down the street from the university. It's a privately owned property, and they have a lot of, they do a lot of weddings and events and those sorts of things. And in addition to the museum is the Chamber of Commerce is also has a building there as well. So there's a lot of activity here, and this is a great place for a museum of any type, but especially for a community museum. This museum is an all-volunteer museum. It has 10 members on its board, and it relies on volunteers. It relies on students from the university. It relies on groups within the community. And its mission is to document and exhibit the history, arts, and culture of the San Fernando Valley in an inclusive way. And in this past couple of years, the board has been reflecting a lot on how they could improve their inclusivity, how they could reach out to new groups and engage a broader population in the San Fernando Valley. So I'm just going to show you just a few images just so you can get the flavor of the museum. This is in front of the museum, a lot of open space. I hope it doesn't become parking space. I hope they do exhibits there. There's a new artifact. This wagon came from John Wayne's movie set that just came into the yard. This is a view from the left if you leave the building, this open space. And this is a view of something that is called the Ruinas. And there used to be a building here. Now they're going to use this as an area for sculptures. And here is to the left of that is an area where they're putting more sculptures outside. They just attained these dinosaurs from an Iranian artist who is lived in the valley. And they have, these dinosaurs just came. They haven't unwrapped them yet, but they're really interesting contribution, really interesting donation to the museum. So I want to shift. The museum also, I should have included some pictures. You might get a glimpse of it from some of the other pictures now, but of the inside of the museum, it is a sort of narrow space of about 1,000 feet, and it has a small office space, and they have several exhibits that are also there. But due to COVID, the outdoor space is going to be really key in having, sort of socially distanced events. So I want to talk about some of the advantages, the aids that the strengths of the museum. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that the museum faces. The strength of this museum is that it's recognized as an important institution in the Valley, and citizens frequently donate interesting artifacts. So it's fun and engaging, just like working on a word puzzle to piece together the history and the meaning of the artifacts that come to the museum and to decide what to do with them. But puzzling through and piecing ideas together is also a very good metaphor for how the museum operates and how it is organized. Few members of the museum are trained experts in curation, but the members in the museum are very dedicated and they do everything possible to get trained, to find answers. It's been surprising to learn some of the efforts that people make. So there's a lot of love and a lot of passion among the group that is there. And just to give you one example, one of the members who is a construction contractor spent a lot of time training himself in how to become a curator and how to become an effective fundraiser. A former avant-garde musician has trained herself in grant writing and has been very successful and in writing loan contract writing. So not coming out of these backgrounds, but developing these skills as they participate in the museum. And others who have no prior experience are willing to pore over manuals and websites for clues about how to structure an archival system for the museum. There are research and writing projects, curation projects, and the volunteers do, A to Z, including building the bases to secure the steel dinosaurs and keep them from falling over onto people. So the museum is really a space for problem solvers. There are any number of interesting problems that are interesting to solve in order to convey history and culture to the public. The community is also, the community museum is also a place for doers. And here we're seeing some of the students from CSUN who spent the summer cataloging artifacts, and they cataloged something like 40 boxes of artifacts over the course of the summer that just kind of fell into the lap of the museum. So they're very busy, very committed to spending time contributing by doing any activity that can be useful. The community museum is also a place where people discuss the vision of the community, and like other public spaces, they learn to interact. They learn about different groups and their values. And so there's a very interesting exchange that goes on in these forums when people come together to talk about how they envision this museum and how that vision resonates with their vision of their community. And it's also a place where members of the opportunity members of the community have an opportunity to plan how they would like to tell their own stories. And here is a family, actually a group of members who are making a donation to the museum, and they're discussing the storyline and the placement of these sculptures that have been in their family for several decades. So there's a lot of really good, interesting, wholesome, fun engagement, a lot of learning. And so it's a really interesting place to be. It gives you a sense of possibility, again, a sense of empowerment, a sense of belonging. And these things are not always associated with every form of public space. There's a flip side to this, though, which is that the sense of possibility is sometimes mediated by challenges, and it is sometimes hard to bring people together. Here I want to discuss the museum's project to redefine a timeline, which they hope to paint onto the facade of the museum. And this timeline needs to be refreshed. It ends in something like, 2010 or something like that. So more points need to be added to the timeline. But also, there's been a lot of interesting discussions taking a critical look at what pieces of history were considered important enough to include on the timeline and what was left out of the timeline. So there's been an enormous amount of discussion about the events that were overlooked and in the earlier version of the timeline. What you're looking at here is the earlier version, which is now in revision. There was a lot of discussion about the extent to which local tribes are represented. Are they fairly represented? Are they equally represented? Are immigrant groups represented? There was discussion about how people researched the information. Did they find, were they reporting and including superficial information? Who's the expert here that the museum should turn to? There was a very interesting debate about that particular question. There was also debate about the words that could be used to describe historical events. There was a lot of discussion about word choice and whether some words were too loaded or whether some words were not loaded enough. For example, there was a very long debate about whether or not we should, what words we were using to talk about the colonization of Native Americans and the role of the Spanish missions in this process. And some felt it was necessary to describe the missions as an intentional tool of colonization. And others felt that that by missing the opportunity to teach about the methods of colonization, that the representation of this history would be soft-pedaled and would not lead American Indians to feel very welcomed in the museum. So there's a lot of discussion about even how to convey history and whose history. So there are plans to share the timeline with community members in specific communities, but even that process is even complex, as there's a discussion about, well, who should be included in this process? Will this process ever, will we be able to ever complete this process? And how will we treat the feedback that we receive? So there's hope that the artists will actually contribute when it comes time for them to design a way of representing this history, because we're hoping that they'll be able to visually express the notion that there are multiple histories, not just one strand of history, and possibly a timeline that can be added to as we move forward in time. Another debate that came up in the museum had to do with Tarzan. So debates about this former exhibit related to Edgar Rice Burroughs. So Edgar Rice Burroughs is the creator of Tarzan, and he was a resident of the San Fernando Valley. And discussing this particular individual and his contributions were challenging. And it even caused some people to question their participation in the museum. Burroughs was so celebrated, in the early 20th century that in 1929, citizens in the valley decided to name their town Tarzan. Tarzana, actually, the name of the town is called Tarzana, and it's inspired by Edgar Rice Burroughs' image of Tarzan. Well, okay, over the years, the museum has celebrated his work. It's commemorated Tarzan. Tarzan is a globally recognized, cultural image. And so it's brought a lot of attention, a lot of people to the museum. But recently, new members of the museum have begun to question the importance of addressing Edgar Rice Burroughs' work and whether it should be included in the museum, because it's been discovered that, some of the language and some of the text is quite racist, actually blatantly racist and sexist at the same time. And so it was argued that, maybe this stuff shouldn't be on display. And it was argued that it's insufficient to ask audiences to put such discourse and imagery into historical context in order to, quote unquote, appreciate it. It's insufficient to do that because racist and sexist ideas are still in circulation. So in a way, it was argued that, continuing to display work by Edgar Rice Burroughs was being complicit and even contributing to the social reproduction of problematic ideas. So others argued not to cancel the display and the exhibitions, but to use these exhibitions as a teachable moment. And still others argued that turning racist and sexist imagery into a teachable moment in and of itself is too much emotional work to undertake. Others argue that the museum has a moral responsibility to teach the public how to interpret problematic discourse and imagery. And some members wondered if they collectively, if people in the museum had the right skills to successfully do this. And at the end of the day, there was no clear argument, and there was a lot of debate. And the board of the museum decided to put Burroughs' artifacts into storage. And since they've been in storage, there really hasn't been any more discussion about it either. I think the right decision was made here, but it was also interesting that it didn't leave people feeling happy or victorious about steering the museum in the right direction. And rather, these very ugly issues left people feeling uncomfortable and ambivalent about the next steps. So the last image of the museum I want to share with you doesn't really have to do with cultural representation, but it provides a context for understanding the challenges that museums are going through. So, on the one hand, I've said that museums are struggling with issues of resources, as any nonprofit often does. Now they're struggling with these cultural issues as well. And then on top of that, there are these new issues that are emerging. So this parking lot is the result of a new image. The museum was critiqued for not being in compliance with handicap parking in its former space. It wasn't just a critique; it was a lawsuit was sent to the museum, and the museum had to respond. And so, when the museum moved across the street, the landlord quickly put in this parking lot to comply and to avoid this. But evidently what's interesting is that the lawsuit was sort of an invented thing where a lot of these small museums were getting lawsuits. They were sort of preyed upon by individuals that possibly hadn't even visited the museum or any of the other organizations that they were seeking to settle as a way of earning money. Of course, every museum, every public space should be accessible. But it's just interesting that the identity of the museum also framed the museum as a specific or a particular target for these kinds of endeavors. And in order to comply and to protect the museum, the landlords felt it necessary to just quickly address this. So what's interesting about it is that you can see the parking space, but the parking space isn't connected to the driveway, to the street. It's sort of just a space on its own. And I just sort of find that interesting to contemplate the way that these institutions have to quickly respond and quickly adjust and quickly, take actions that sometimes result in, situations that look like things haven't been fully planned out because they don't have a depth of support and they need to quickly respond in order to protect themselves. So we have this parking space that we hope will be used, but the space got paved in and made before the actual rest of the lot was even planned. So there's sometimes this lack of synchronizing of tasks and plans that need to be taken care of. So these are some of the stories that I wanted to share to suggest or to convey that museums are really very interesting and unique spaces. They're free. There's a lot of exciting things that go on. They're very productive spaces, and very interesting things can happen in these spaces. There can be very positive things, but there are these other challenges that are going on. There can be a number of uncomfortable things, a number of things that also make people feel, ambivalent about investing a lot of time. And so it's interesting to think about this combination of characteristics in a public space such as this, where it is both full of possibility, but also fraught at the same time. So that is what I wanted to share with you. And I'm so very interested in hearing your thoughts and what you make of this and how you think these museums can help communities, how you think these museums fit into the fabric of the city.
Thank you very much, Susan. Perdón, en español. Muchas gracias, Susan. Un placer haber escuchado la ponencia. Y sí, justo esta última pregunta que haces es la que me motiva a mí a generar la conversación. ¿De qué manera una propuesta, ¿no?, de pequeño museo, de micromuseo, que genera vínculos, ¿no?, en la comunidad, puede, por un lado, replicarse en otras ciudades? Y eso va de la mano con una de las preguntas que me han hecho llegar, que justamente nos dice esto, que déjame un minuto para poder leerla. ¿Cómo propiciar que otras comunidades se apropien de sus elementos culturales y de qué manera o qué políticas públicas pueden promoverse para que este tipo de experiencias puedan integrarse a la ciudad? Podemos empezar con esas preguntas y luego pasamos a otras que también tengo aquí que me han hecho llegar. Gracias.
Oh, can I answer? Can you hear me? Okay.
Sí, adelante.
Muchas gracias. I mean, I think one thing I've noticed about this particular museum and about, others in these cultural institutions, especially the historical societies, is that they're just full of people who are extraordinarily passionate for one reason or another. They just feel like they know something that others need to know. And they feel like it's really important to get people to, to have people with whom to share this information. And it's somehow, it's a good question. Where do they get this passion from? Where does it come from? And as I'm trying to say, I mean, some people are professionally from entirely different fields, but they just have this love of learning, this love of learning about their community. They love discussing things. They love sharing and showing you how much they know. And it's interesting. So how do you engender that kind of passion is a very good question. Are there places in, communities where people are passionate about other things or these sorts of things, or what are people passionate about, such that they want to get together and share? Because I think the core group of people in the museums are these extraordinarily passionate people, and then there's another layer of people around them who are enthusiastic, but have competing obligations and priorities, and they show up, but they're not often the people who reach out and plan things and stay up all night putting exhibitions together and those sorts of things. So I think it's a question of finding some of these people.
Gracias. Y claro, estas personas que son fundamentales, ¿no? Para el éxito, para la idea, para la sostenibilidad también, muchas veces, y lo vemos en otros procesos vinculados a líderes comunitarios, si no encuentran las condiciones apropiadas, en algún momento se cansan. Y en ese sentido, el rol del gobierno local o de las instituciones de la comunidad es importante para lograr que esta energía, esta pasión se mantenga viva, que esta chispa se mantenga viva. ¿De qué manera, a partir de este caso que nos has mostrado, Susan, u otros que conozcas, qué incentivos existen para justamente mantener viva esa chispa en estos líderes comunitarios?
I think maybe there might be something as simple as people having an audience of some sort that says, yes, you are a community historian and you know a lot and you're really valued. So one thing that goes on in this museum that I think is successful is this network of community historians. Community historians, in my mind, I define them as, citizens who love history and independently, some of them are independently, researching for the fun of it. Some of them are writing because they feel like these stories need to be told. And there's a purpose to getting their message out. And so I think having audiences where that feeling like this is important, this needs to be shared is can be very validating and keep people going. I think, for example, one of our board members is an African-American who grew up in Pacoima, which is a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley that is where a lot of African-American veterans bought homes after the 1940s. And she is on a mission because she realizes how the history of the community is so important in everyday conversation. But yet there's very little scholarship about it. And so she just independently decided that's for me to do. And just, after a while, she has spent a lot of time meeting so many different people that she has this network that she feels responsible to. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think a lot of this has to do with like personal relationships, the way people feed off of having an audience to share, and then organize something for another peer in another historical society and provide an audience for them and sort of get this back and forth conversation going across different groups. At least that's what I see going on in the San Fernando Valley, is that these community historians are often invited, to each other's organizations to speak. And that audience really, fuels their enthusiasm to keep going. And then of course some of them do publish. And so then they do have, credentials, they are recognized in a more, formal way through their publications and the projects that they undertake.
Muchas gracias. Entonces estamos identificando que necesitamos capital social y agencia, ¿no? Para efectos de lograr un proceso exitoso. Y esto va de la mano de otra de las preguntas que nos hacen, la voy a leer aquí, perdón. Y a ver, un minutito que me cargue la página. Ok, la pregunta es, ¿cómo asegurar la sostenibilidad en un proceso de este tipo de intervenciones? Y cómo lograr que se escale el proyecto comunitario. O de repente, aquí esto lo agrego yo, ¿no? De repente no necesita ser escalado, justamente porque tiene este carácter hiperlocalista, ¿no? ¿Qué nos puedes comentar, Susana?
Yeah, I think my thought about it is I'm coming around to the idea that a community project like this ought to maybe have one individual who is not a volunteer, who's paid to provide some continuity. I'm seeing that as being really important because volunteers, as I say, there's like a core group of people and they will volunteer all the time. They just really are the bottom line, but that's not everyone. And the day that something happens to that core group of people really threatens the continuity and the sustainability of the group. And so that's one issue, is that I feel like the museum would be strengthened if it had one paid staff member who kind of kept the archives, but for the administration, kept in touch, because it's very interesting, kept in touch with all of the community partners, in a professional manner. Because I guess one thing about these museums is that they're places that require such a broad range of skills. If you think about it, they're really rich in skills, but that's really complex to support and have, in an ongoing way without things falling apart. You need people who have artistic skills, people who can write, people who know people and can bring people together, people who know how to market, can be really helpful. And then people who are willing to set up when there are events, or people who are willing to docent. So it's such a broad range of, skills that help these, these groups, that I think continuity and sustainability would be enhanced if at least one person or two people, maybe they're not the people who necessarily determine the direction of the group, but they provide some ongoing, continuity for the group. But I guess the reason I started by saying I'm coming around to that idea is because, there is this conversation in the Museum of the San Fernando Valley about what that means to have someone who's paid, because there's a lot of pride in saying this is a full-on, volunteer organization. We do it, and they're so protective of that image of being all volunteers. So it's a contradiction to that image, that point of pride, to have someone on the payroll. But at the same time, it actually might provide but I think also that that's a far cry. Having one or two people on the, who are paid is a very far cry from having something that is, privatized. There's a lot of steps between there and then. So sometimes I think discussing these things, having a sense of looking at other models of, organizations and their histories has also been really helpful to understand, how certain groups met their limits and how certain groups have been able to continue on, and what kinds of decisions did some groups have to make in order to go on, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's good to, which is, share and learn from other groups, which is why in the Museum of the San Fernando, another project that we're working on is developing a consortium of similar like-minded organizations, so that there can be trading information, can be trainings that could be useful to to various groups in this network, that everyone is doing similar work and doing it on a shoestring, and needing support. So that's something we're also working on, is developing that network.
Excelente, muchas gracias. Esta última reflexión que haces me invita a pensar que no solamente la persona eventualmente que sí recibe un pago tiene que ser alguien local, ¿no?, de la comunidad, y además de qué manera también un proceso como este activa la economía local, ¿no?, que es importante para efectos de generar prosperidad y generar ventajas, ¿no?, para las personas que hacen parte de esta comunidad, y en ese sentido encontrar cómo los valores culturales y de identidad, de orgullo, ¿no?, de pertenencia, son también a su vez catalizadores, ¿no?, de progreso, de prosperidad, ¿no?, de calidad de vida. Creo que eso es bien importante. Podemos hacer, si quieres, una última reflexión, porque ya me están avisando que estamos con el tiempo y yo no he hecho caso a la anterior advertencia, así que adelante, Susan, y con eso podemos seguir cerrando.
Final reflection. Well, I guess the final thing I could say is I do think that these spaces are so important. There's, as I tried to get across in some of what I was saying, is that they're just very fortifying for individuals. And they also are places where lots of different kinds of people can find their place and find their way to contribute. And I think that's really important too. There's just something very beautiful about, appreciating, the diverse kinds of people and their, creativity and different kinds of contributions. So I am all for this kind of organization, and this is definitely a kind of a project for the people who love people. That's another thing. You gotta like people to work with these organizations. And the other things I tried to share, I hope they don't overwhelm people. I do want to point out that, it's not helpful to also be uncritical about some of the issues, that these museums face. And so this is not meant to discourage people or weigh people down, to realize there are these issues around cultural representation. It's just that we all need to engage in these issues. We all need to come to a better understanding of one another. And this happens through, interactions with each other. So I think in this way, small museums like this are wonderful places to have those processes start, for people to, learn about other people who are different from them. This can happen in the small community museum.
Muchísimas gracias, Susan. No solo nos dejas con muchas ganas de ir a visitar el museo del cual nos has contado hoy día, esperamos poder hacerlo en algún momento, sino también un poco con las ganas de ver de qué manera nosotros, desde la organización en la que hacemos parte y desde las redes que tenemos de personas trabajando por el espacio público, podemos generar una oportunidad para invitar, ¿no?, a comunidades a llevar adelante ese tipo de procesos, que en muchos casos son sueños o ideas que no se sienten con mucha mirada de ser concretas, ¿no? Y más bien hay que demostrar que sí es posible, y por lo tanto ver de qué manera podemos generar estímulos para estos líderes, para estos apasionados de sus barrios, de sus comunidades, y que tienen pues muchas cosas que contar y muchas cosas que dejar, ¿no?, como legado. Y finalmente es eso, ¿no? Los barrios, las ciudades son lo que son a partir de eso, de su gente y de sus historias. Y acá agrego algo más, cuando hablabas también de cómo incorporar este tipo de propuestas a la misma ciudad, ¿no?, al entorno urbano, ciertamente pues hay una serie de servicios, ¿no?, que pueden darse de manera complementaria Y ahí justamente en esas comunidades y barrios, ¿no? Yo pensaba en muchas zonas de nuestro país y la posibilidad de que se promuevan bibliotecas comunitarias, que se promuevan espacios culturales, que se promueva ferias, ¿no? Que puedan ir vinculadas, aunque no necesariamente sean parte de, y por lo tanto justamente se logre ese objetivo de integración comunitaria, ¿no? Pero bueno, sin más, yo tengo que dar palabras de despedida. Déjame por favor llegar a mi guión. Ok, sí, nos piden que nos tomemos una foto, así que te pediría, Susan, que hagamos esa parte protocolar, y además, bueno, por supuesto, agradecer a todos y a todas. Nos pueden avisar para la foto, amigos de producción. Ahí está, María, excelente.
All right.
Ahí está. Sigan sumándose, aquellos que quieran salir, por supuesto. ¿Ya estamos? ¿Sí? Listo, muchísimas gracias. Muchas gracias a ti, Susan. Muchas gracias a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos aquí en Lima por el acompañamiento, el apoyo. Vamos a poder generar conversaciones y yo estoy segura que vamos a spark the joy, ¿no? Para lograr sacar adelante procesos como estos y provocar el interés de ciudadanos y ciudadanas aquí en nuestras comunidades. Y bueno, sin más, agradecerles. Tenemos unos anuncios que hacer, si me ayudan, chicos, con la transmisión de los mismos aquí en pantalla. A ver, en lo que va apareciendo la pantalla, tenemos unas sesiones esta semana del cuarto foro Ciudades Cómo Vamos. Sí, creo que no se pudo ver, pero bueno, tenemos un par de sesiones. Pueden ver el programa en la página web del Facebook o Instagram, Twitter del Lima Cómo Vamos. Y ahí está la información para los paneles que nos quedan esta semana y también, por supuesto, de la próxima. Hay un poco de todo. Tenemos espacios para proyectos de defensa a la ciudad, desde una práctica más jurídica. Va a haber unas conversaciones en torno a temas de movilidad y bicicleta. Vamos a tener conversaciones con temas también de electromovilidad y temas de transporte sostenible, así que hay para todos los gustos. Aquí justamente me llegan a mostrar la imagen. Tenemos el taller de parques accesibles, que es este sábado. Es un proyecto interesante para lograr inclusión y accesibilidad para personas con discapacidad física. Este es el sábado 13 de 10 a 12. Ese mismo día hay otro taller que tiene que ver con salud mental, cómo adaptar el espacio público y a las condiciones diversas, ¿no? De la neurodiversidad y sobre todo a las condiciones de salud mental en un contexto ahora de pandemia que claramente ha exacerbado, ¿no? Estas necesidades y este tipo de atenciones. Tenemos también ya el sábado 27, este taller que es una suerte de hackathon, que se llama Creatón, para hackear la ciudad, para promover y propiciar soluciones para la ciudad que queremos, ¿no? De la mano también de aliados, en este caso Editorial Búho Eléctrico. Creo que hay alguno más. Es importante para esta Creatón que se vayan en equipos, para sumarse como equipos. El miércoles 10 de noviembre tenemos un panel sobre cómo vamos en la accesibilidad de nuestros espacios públicos a partir del recojo de información y datos para que se trabajaron con la organización Inclulab, también nuevamente enfocados en accesibilidad para personas con discapacidad en la ciudad y los espacios públicos, y aquí se hizo una encuesta y se recogieron datos para saber cómo estamos en ese tema, y bueno, de la mano de los socios y aliados de Inclulab se va a presentar estos resultados y vamos a conversar con autoridades del gobierno. Creo que ya estamos, así que muchísimas gracias. Muchas gracias, Susan. Muchas gracias nuevamente a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos aquí en Lima. Y es un placer para mí y para nosotros estar con ustedes. Y bueno, vamos a continuar impulsando este tipo de ideas para que pasen cada vez más. Muchas gracias. Chao.